Hey, welcome questers. We're always questing for a better game, right? I want to talk about an experience that I had at a game. It wasn't a game convention, it was a game retreat. So it was very interesting, the normal game convention. Normal game convention, you go, you have your one shot and you're done, right? But this was a retreat, so we were there for the whole week with the same people, and what it turned out to be was I was going to run a mini campaign of 3 interconnected games over the course of 3 days, okay? So what became interesting was I had 2 different groups that ran the same game, so that's a very unusual situation. The other one was the groups were very different, right? The first group were a bunch of newer players. There was one absolutely new player. The other players had played very old versions or older versions of D&D and so weren't familiar with 5e. So I only had one player who was experienced, which was good because then I could use that player to help the others. But so I had a very inexperienced group on one hand for my first game, and then for the second game with the exact same campaign, I had old hat gamers. I had they were very familiar with D&D 5e. They knew all the rules ins and out and that kind of thing. So it was very interesting having the 2 separate groups, one that was a very new group and one that was a very experienced group. So I want to tell you about my observations of the 2 groups because the retreat kind of made that possible, right? It's kind of like if you're having one game that you're running a certain campaign, another game you're running a different campaign, even if the groups are different, it's kind of hard to directly compare the groups because, they're having different experiences, right? But if you're running the same exact scenario for both groups and it's such a close proximity to each other, it's really easy to observe the differences in the groups. And I want to talk to you about that. Now, I'm not saying that one way to play is better than the other or anything. I'm not criticizing these people. I'm just making observations about the different styles of play.
If you're looking for adventure, grab the modules each month to support the channel and play the campaign with your gaming group. You're sure to get hooked on adventure.
What I did was I had kind of a Strangers in a Strange Land game where they run into statues of themselves. They kind of pass out and wake up in this other land, and they're kind of between 2 forces. One is the traditional bad guy force, and the other is like the humans. They're in this kind of fort on a hill, right? It's kind of a town fort on a hill. And so they get attacked by the monstrous creatures, they run to the fort, they meet the people and that kind of thing. And when they get there, there are statues of them in the town, so they're hailed as heroes immediately. Like the people know of their legend and this kind of thing. So it was interesting, and it threw the players off immediately. But what happened was in the campaign, through the course of the campaign, was this wizard had created these creatures and was manipulating the players because the wizard wanted to see which side the players would choose and favor, and then go against the other side. That was the plan. That was the game of the wizard, right? That's what he wanted to do. So I used the first 2 days setting up the interesting situations and the moral dilemmas with the 2 groups, and then they meet the wizard. He explains what they're supposed to do, and then I just threw them into the last day. So I had very little prep for the last day. It was really, what are you going to do? You're kind of in this impossible situation to choose between these 2 sides. What are you going to do, right? So that was made for a very interesting game. So first off, it's a very interesting play style with the 2 groups, because the first group was inexperienced and the next group was very experienced, right? So it's fun to see how that works. Now, the inexperienced group, it tends to be this. It tends to be that they kind of tell you what they do, they're learning how their characters work, and then, the rules kind of follow that, right? Whereas the experienced group kind of everything follows from the rules. Like, they knew the rules so well, they knew what works together, they know the little tricks and all that kind of thing, so they can utilize those in a game. So they tend to think of it more from the rules perspective and then come at it from the opposite way. So it seems like, yeah, the inexperienced people come at it from, okay, here's my actions, here's what I'm doing, how does that work with the rules? And the experienced group is like, okay, here's how the rules work, now I'm going to make it work with how the game is going, what's happening in the game. So it's an interesting approach how the 2 groups approach problems in a game when they're inexperienced and when they're experienced. I was running a theater of the mind game, so distances weren't that important. You know, the kind of thing is like, okay, so if you're in melee, you can pretty much melee with anybody that's around. If you want to be ranged and kind of stand back, it'll take someone to like maybe a round to get to you, right? And the group that's not so used to the rules doesn't even give that a second thought. Like they don't worry about how many feet something away is or whatever. They're just like, oh, it's taking me a turn to get there. Okay, whatever. You know, they just think of it that way. But the experienced group, you know, they're like, well, how many feet is 100 feet away? Is it, you know, 30 feet away? Is it, you know, so I kind of had to break that down for the second group, that wasn't going to be my play style. Like, we weren't going to worry so much about the ranges. I mean, if you have a long range spell, you can pretty much cast it at anything, you know, unless it's off miles in the distance or something. We weren't too worried about that. So I had to kind of break that kind of wanting to know the exact ranges down for the second group. I'm not criticizing the group for that, because that's in the rules. That's how the spells work. They have ranges and you can move a certain distance. But like I say, I played with Theater Mind, I played a very loose game as far as ranges go. And so I had to kind of break the second group down a little more than the first, because the first really didn't worry about that. I said, oh, can I attack that? I said, yeah, okay, go ahead. And so that's how it worked, right? If you wanted to move away from something, they got attack of opportunity. If you're in melee, if you're not in melee, you know, it's a different story. So I kind of had to get that across really more to the second group than the first. There was a point where the players had to defend the human fort, right? Because these monsters, they didn't know anything about these monsters. They're just savage creatures at this point. And the savage creatures are throwing themselves at the fort, and the players want to help, right? So they're asking, so the whole thing is like, okay, how can I help during the war effort? So instead of playing everything out, combat, hours and hours of combat, you know, and that kind of thing, my idea was that the players tell me how they're helping the war effort. So with the first group, it was like, oh, okay, the warlock got up in the tower, he was sniping targets from the tower, right? You know, someone was doing triage, so if they were like, if someone was hurt on the palisade, they were pulling them off, you know, healing them, and then, you know, plugging the hole, you know, maybe fighting a little bit to plug the hole, right? So it was kind of very, you know, just very narrative based, as opposed to like, you know, turn or power based. And then I just had them make rolls. It was kind of a skill challenge, and I had to make rolls depending on what they told me they were doing. Then I picked the skills or whatever that they would roll. So one player in the experienced group was fun. She had like a disguise kit, so she said, oh, I'm dressing up like these creatures and I'm going to try to ambush them. And I thought that was just a really cool idea. That was a fun idea. Now the second group, I don't know if I made it as clear to them what I was looking for, but they really wanted to play it like, okay, I'm casting this spell, I'm casting that, I'm doing this combat, I'm doing that. I'm like, no, I don't want a specific action. I just want you to tell me what you're going to do, you know, during the fight, during the whole fight. Like, what are you doing? Like, what's your kind of role? Are you going to be on the wall casting spells down on the enemies that are trying to climb up like ants? Are you going to be sniping people? Are you going to be, you know, helping the wounded? Are you know, any number of things that you could do, or just fight on the wall? So any number of things you could do. So, but they kept wanting to do, okay, I'm going to do this action. I'm like, no, I don't want you to, just tell me what you're going to do, and then I'll tell you what I want you to roll, okay? So it was a little harder to get that across to the experienced players, because they were looking at it, not their fault, they were looking at it through the eyes of the rules. And I was kind of not necessarily using the rules in that way. I was using it more as a narrative-based thing, a skill challenge to, you know, to make it, to just kind of make the time pass quicker, and it would still give the same effect. It's still showing that the players are helping in some interesting way, and still coming up with a cool plan for how their character is going to interact, but it's not the hours and hours of playing out a combat where these creatures are trying to climb over the wall. There was this magic mouth, but it was gummed up with green slime, like green slime was running down the wall, and the idea was that it had gummed up the mouth, and they had to clear the mouth to hear what it was going to say to them. It was going to tell them something interesting and something useful to them when they went to this old temple. So yeah, and that just seemed like a pretty straightforward challenge to me, but it actually turned out to be really difficult for the group that didn't, the inexperienced group. Like, they were having a hard, like they had a spoon and they were trying to scrape away the slime, and it was just like, oh, it was melting the spoon, you know, that kind of, any organic matter that touches the stuff dissolves and that kind of thing. So they were they were having a problem coming up with something, where the second group's like just basically used a torch on it or something, you know, or a fire blast spell or something, and just cleared it away. So, you know, it's funny because the old hats, you know, they're thinking of the game in those terms of those kind of like getting over challenges, like the most economical way possible, where newer groups necessarily don't know all the tropes and that kind of thing, and they may get stuck on something that just seemed to me like so easy to do, that you just use a torch or, you know, even a frost spell or something, whatever, to clear this stuff out. And then, you know, they just couldn't, they were trying it with a stick and it was dissolving the stick, and they were trying it with a spoon, and, you know, it was, and they couldn't think of like to just hit it with fire or something like that. They had the means, but they were just, it was just not coming to them like that. So that can happen with any group, but you can find, but what I find is it can happen a lot more with like inexperienced groups, because they don't know the tropes, they don't know, you know, they haven't gone through all these like type of scenarios before, and sometimes that stuff just doesn't come into their head as quickly as it might with an experienced group. So this temple they were in was like kind of cursed, and there was this thing called the One, which was essentially like a chaos spawn, right? And it just absorbed others into it, and the cult that was at this old ancient temple, this you know, this ruined temple, they would come here and join the One, you know, and become part of the spawn, and it was in the last kind of boss room of this place. But they found a book on a dead, you know, on a dead cultist that was kind of explained the One and what it was and all this kind of stuff, and it was essentially like a cursed tome, you know, and it had a silver skull on it. And the kind of the reason the silver skull was on there was to like warn you not to you know, delve into these secrets of evil that, you know, could change you forever. And it was funny later on, if you read the book, it could actually turn you into the spawn. So that, I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But it was interesting how the two groups approached it, because they both found the book, and the inexperienced group, the warlock of the group was the experienced player, and I must say it was nice, because both wizards, like in the groups, wanted the tome. Okay, they role played that well. The first group actually had a warning, like the skull warned them. So basically, when they found the skull, they found there were two rubies that fit in the eyes of the skull, two round rubies like eyes, and the skull came to life, and it was like warning you, don't you know, don't look at this book, and it was trying to ward you away from it. Well, the warlock's like, pusha, you know, and, you know, takes the book and that kind of thing. So yeah. So, but the second group also took the book, and the wizard took the book. But what happened was they found the rubies, but they would not put them in the skull. Like one player's like, why don't you put them in the skull? And like they just totally ignored that player. Like the person with the rubies would not put them in the skull. I don't know if it was a case of like they thought the skull would be trapped, and so they're like, no, we're not doing that, you know, kind of thing. Or they just, I don't know, just didn't want to do it. They didn't really explain why they didn't want to do it. The one player's like, put them in the skull, put them in the skull. And the other, no, we're not doing it. So they never explained to me why they didn't want to do it. I assume they think the skull was trapped, but it was actually, the skull was actually a warning about the book. So the first group got the warning, the inexperienced group got the warning, and the second group didn't. So that might have been a case of the second group being overly cautious, you know what I'm saying? Where the first group, you know, may not be so cautious about traps and that kind of thing. So they get through the temple, they run into the One, the chaos spawn. It was a pretty awesome fight. It was a great fight. But the magic mouth had told them that there was a way they would have to go through this portal to meet the wizard that they were seeking, right? So they go through the portal, they meet the wizard, and the wizard's telling them that he created this race, and he's pitting them against the humans, and he wants them to decide, you know, which race will be favored. And he gives them this little gem that basically says you throw it at one side and it'll give the other side a huge advantage, right? And he didn't tell them what it did, he just gave it to them. And then he's like, be gone! So they disappear and they appear back on the plain, and they're surrounded by these beastmen creatures, and they're taken to the tribal leader, and they talk to him, and they're actually seem much more civilized than the human players or the human NPCs. But so now they've met both sides. They've interacted with both sides. And they have to, what I did was I set all this up for the first 2 sessions, and then the last session I was light on material because I'm like, okay, it's up to you what you're going to do with this, right? How are you gonna solve this kind of no-win situation that you're in, right? So it was fun, and both groups actually really kind of had a similar solution. So that was interesting because I had really no idea how the groups would go. I didn't really know. It was totally up in the air how they would go. As kind of a side note, the wizards who had perused the tome were cursed, and so when they destroyed the chaos spawn, they were going to become the new chaos spawn. So I was just waiting for the time to do it. The one warlock made a saving throw from the first group, and he didn't turn into it. But the second wizard failed horribly on his saving throw and turned into the spawn and was like rolling around picking up dead bodies and like rolled back to the temple and became the one. That was fun. That was fun. But the group ended up removing curse on him. He was just kind of slimed, and he was back to normal. But so that was fun. But the second group, it was interesting because they had found this cavern, and it had like these dragon remains, and the wizard had taken this tooth. And he wanted to do this thing where both sides were about to clash, because both teams had actually set up like a peace talk with each side, and it got sabotaged by someone who didn't want the peace talks to go well in the human faction. And so both sides are coming at each other, and they're kind of in the middle. So the wizard in the second group had this dragon tooth, and he decided that he wanted to try to make this. There was an alchemist in the village, and he wanted to try to make this sleep spell that would put everybody to sleep. And I thought that was a really cool idea. And I love that because it was like, this wasn't a rule thing. It wasn't in the rules somewhere that you could do this. It was just like he decided, oh, can I do this? And I thought, oh, sure, if you roll high enough, you can do it. So, he utilized the apothecary in the village and that kind of thing to pull this off. And he rolled excellent, so he was able to do it. So that was cool. But unfortunately, he's the one that turned into the chaos spawn and rolled back to the temple after they had their kind of minor victory by putting everybody to sleep. But it was fun because, nobody likes being put in that situation that the wizard put them in, right? Because he's like, haha, I'm lording over you. Nobody likes that. And nobody likes being made to choose between one side or the other. Each side had their good and bad. And nobody wants to be the destroyer of one side or the other. They want to, most people want to have some kind of resolution that's satisfying, get revenge on the person who set them up, who made them be the ones to decide this. And both groups really went for that, and they used the marble against the wizard himself in a very similar fashion to destroy the wizard. And but the thing was, when they destroyed the wizard, they couldn't go home. So I kind of had them narrate at the end like what their characters were doing in this new strange land that they were in, because the wizard said, oh, if you play this game for me and decide, I will send you back home and I'll give you your greatest wish. So not only was he going to send them home, he was going to give them their greatest wish, right? And they're like, oh crap. But both sides, both groups didn't like being put in that situation, and almost did this exact same thing to the wizard, which was interesting because it wasn't any prompting on my part. This was all, I just let them roll with what they were doing, and it ended up being that way. So it was a very similar situation for both groups. They both tried to broker a peace. That broke down because this human warlord sabotaged it, and then they were in the middle of the fight, and they ended up, taking the wizard out and making a peace, because once the wizard was taken out, he was the impetus for the creatures attacking, so it kind of took that out, the wind out of their sails, so to speak. So it was fun that each, you know, even the inexperienced and the experienced group had a very similar outcome for their games. And let me just say, it was amazing running 3 games in a row, you know, back to back, which is so rare to do. You know, my monthly game, I usually have a monthly game, you know, at home. So it's rare to just run the same group 3 days in a row, and you know, everything's fresh in your mind. You know, so I was able to build up a really great story and put them in a tricky situation that, you know, they creatively got out of. And my first group's like, oh, when you come back, we want to play in your game. We're gonna be your group. So that, I mean, how much prouder can you be as a DM than that? But yeah, I wanted to talk about this because I thought it was an interesting, you know, case study as far as like an inexperienced group and an experienced group. And I hope you found some interest in my observations, and you know, things that can help you in your own games, you know, when you run them, and think about the players that are inexperienced and experienced and how that works in your game. Hey, thanks again for watching. Make sure to subscribe to Quest Givers if you like what you've seen here. Also check out our website, questgivers.com. We've got some great quests. We've written quests that the kind of quests I like to run, like I was talking about for this video. So check out questgivers.com. Thanks guys, take care and happy gaming.